not only do we need to electrify the economies in developed worlds, we also need to electrify the more than 50% of the human population that does not have access to energy today. So one of the other panels I was listening to said, we need a revolution, not an evolution. And I would actually argue from a deep tech standpoint, we need both. We need evolution in our existing technologies, and we need revolution with new technologies.
Hardware to Save a Planet explores the technical innovations that are giving us hope in the fight against climate change. Each episode focuses on a specific climate challenge and explores an emerging physical technology solution with the person bringing it into reality. I'm your host, Dylan Garrett. Hardware to Save a Planet is brought to you by Synapse. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to a special episode of Hardware to Save a Planet. Instead of our usual one-on-one conversation with a guest, we're releasing a recording of a live panel discussion that I moderated during an event hosted by Capgemini at this year's New York Climate Week. The topic was the importance of deep tech innovations in the fight against climate change. A quick update for any first-time listeners or viewers, our podcast typically features conversations with founders and pioneers leveraging hardware innovation to tackle climate change, but this panel was such a good fit for the show that I wanted to share it here. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and thanks a lot for listening. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to our panel discussion on the critical need for deep tech in the climate crisis. I'm Dylan Garrett. I'm an engineer. I've spent a lot of my career developing products based on deep tech, so this is a topic I'm pretty excited about and interested in. My role is I lead our industrial and climate tech business for Synapse, which is a Capgemini company. I'm also going to give a shameless plug for my podcast, Hardware to Save a Planet. Sorry, we've been just talking about podcasts. This is the last time I'm going to plug it, so check it out. And yeah, I think before we introduce the panelists, I'm going to start with a very short story that I think kind of sets the stage for the discussion we're going to have. So this was a couple weeks ago, I was talking to somebody in climate tech. This is a person I have a lot of respect for. And I said, I'm doing this panel in New York. And he was like, oh, what's the topic? I said, we're talking about how important it is that we invest in deep tech innovations to solve climate change. And I expected him to be like, oh yeah, that's awesome. I totally agree. And instead he looked at me and he said, that's a stupid topic. And I thought, I was a little offended, but I took a deep breath. I asked him to elaborate, and I'm kind of glad I did because he gave a really good argument. And I think it is a good kind of challenge for this panel and context setting. And his point, I'll summarize, was essentially that deep tech, by definition, refers to solutions that need to overcome substantial scientific and engineering risk and challenges in order to be realized. That means they take a lot of time and money invested in them before they can have climate impact. And then even then, there's risk that there's no guarantee that they'll kind of have the impact we're looking for. And climate change is a now problem, right? We need to be addressing climate change now. So his argument is we should be putting all of our resources into technologies that are low risk, that are ready to scale today. Solar, wind, electric vehicles, lithium batteries, that kind of thing. I do not agree with that opinion. I think it misses the kind of true complexity of the climate change challenge. And I think we have the perfect panelists here to help us understand that. I'll introduce everybody really quickly, and then we'll get into it. So we have Colin Campbell, SVP of Technology at Cambridge Consultants, where he helps clients in a range of industries develop deep tech innovations. We have Trudy Wang, VP of Innovation at Hala Technologies. Their deep tech is a software hardware solution that enables distributed energy resources to scale. Lisa Hansmann, principal at Engine Ventures, a fund that supports deep tech. Before that, she worked at the White House on several bills, including the Inflation Reduction Act. And Kate Kelly, chief of staff at Avalanche Energy. They're developing micro-fusion reactors for hard-to-abate sectors like maritime. There's not much more deep tech than fusion, so pretty excited to have Kate. And Catherine Mizrahi Rodriguez, co-founder and chief implementation officer of Osmoses. Osmoses has novel filters that make gas separations more efficient. And that sounds very specific, but I was kind of blown away to learn that gas separation accounts for 15% of emissions globally. So this is actually a really big deal. So together, we're going to tackle this question of why deep tech. Is this really an important thing for us to be investing in, and why? We'll talk about the challenges of scaling deep tech, and then how to leverage this ecosystem of partnerships that exist to help overcome those challenges. I'm going to leave a little time for Q&A at the end, so at least I will if I manage the clock well. So think of questions as we go, and then we'll come back for one final question with the group here. I'm going to start with Colin, because I think it'd be helpful to sort of get everybody on the same page about what we're talking about. What is deep tech? And you see this with a bunch of different clients in different industries. So what does deep tech mean to you, Colin?
So deep tech means to you, your story was absolutely correct and yet wrong. Deep tech is hard. It's difficult to do. It's risky. It costs a lot of money, but it's solving really complex problems that haven't been solved. So if you assume that those problems have been solved already, then sure, you don't need deep tech, but they haven't. So deep tech is a way to solve that. So that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect that you kind of forget about when you look at these nice definitions that are kind of driven about outcomes really is that it's the people and the passion that go into solving those problems. So the people in this panel really, they want to solve those problems, and they're prepared to go through that risk. They're prepared to take on that challenge. They know it's going to be difficult. They know that it's not going to be a linear journey, but they are really motivated to go and solve those problems creating technology to do it. So I think it's fine to think that all problems have been solved, but I think history of humankind says that's untrue, and we're always looking for new problems to solve and always want to solve them.
Okay, so that's deep tech. Kate, I want to start with you, because like I said, fusion is sort of the quintessential deep tech technology. What would you say to somebody who says we don't need to be investing in deep tech?
Yeah, so my background's electrical engineering, and I spent a really long time in software. And when I decided I wanted to get back into climate tech, I went and I was like, I want to wrap my arms around this problem. I want to understand all the places that you can be doing climate tech. And I really quickly realized that's literally every industry. Like, you can't wrap your arms around this because there is so much to do. Climate tech at the end of the day is about fundamentally changing the way we do every human process. And that is both a huge economic opportunity, but it is also a huge time and capital intensive opportunity. And so you've got both, right? And so now, if I drill down into energy specifically, the International Energy Agency says that we are going to see a 3.4% growth in demand over the next 3 years. And that's a report that came out January, February of this year. I was at a talk yesterday and someone mentioned that they've heard a new stat, which is every 100 days, the demand for power from AI doubles. So our energy demand is just going through the roof. And in doing that, it means that not only do we need innovation in solar and wind, in geothermal, in fission, where, yes, we've had those technologies for a really long time, but they've had inefficiencies where they could get better or smarter. But we also need new technologies like fusion to catch the ball. Fusion is 4 times as energy dense as fission. And the world's energy demand is only going to grow. Not only do we need to electrify the economies that in developed worlds, we also need to electrify the more than 50% of the human population that does not have access to energy today. So one of the other panels I was listening to said, we need a revolution, not an evolution. And I would actually argue from a deep tech standpoint, we need both. We need evolution in our existing technologies, and we need revolution with new technologies.
I'm just curious about that fusion specifically. There's skeptics that kind of say, like, maybe it won't work. Maybe it's 30 years from now when it does. What's your take on that?
We need more shots on goal, right? One of the things that I think is great about fusion is that there are probably many, many, many ways to do it. And you see this proliferation of fusion companies that have arrived on the scene. We've got 45 worldwide, and each group is doing something different. And AI, new magnets, new computational methods have really unlocked that for us. And I think we need all those shots on deck shots on net, because you want to be able to have multiple technologies that we can then continue to innovate on. You don't want to have one technology that's a queue of 2, which means you get twice as much energy out as you put in. You want to have multiple technologies that are innovating so you get 10x, 20x the amount of energy out that you put in. So we have to innovate in this space. But I certainly think it's getting close. Most of the fusion industry believes we'll have power on the grid in the early 2030s from fusion. And that's in the Fusion Industry Association's annual report.
And then I think even if we take this kind of idea of let's just scale the heck out of solar and wind and the renewables we have today, one thing that's been surprising me is just thinking about the kind of level to which that scale needs to happen and the things that start to break along the way, right? And I think that's where Hala is focused, right, Trudy?
Yeah, and I was just mentioning to the panelists that my favorite living organism on the planet is mycelium, because nature learned to create decentralized trading of energy before humans did with the internet, right? So mycelium, if anyone is unaware, is basically the fungi network that lives underneath forests, and they connect all the roots of trees, right? And they allow trees to trade between each other in a kind of market-based economy. And so what we do is we kind of thought about the same kind of mathematical algorithms, and how do we allow every participant in our infrastructure to not feel the climate paralysis that I think has hit a lot of the world, and feel empowered to participate whatever they're bringing to the table. And so anecdotally, as an undergrad, I actually dabbled in fusion research, but it was in a sandbox. And it's so exciting for me to see that we're now taking this living lab live, right? And then another short anecdote, like 3 months ago, I was at RE Plus Houston, and that was my first exposure to a tornado. So the next day I woke up and power lines snap in half, trees all over the place, windows are blown out of parking lot cars, right? And I was like, ChatGPT doesn't have a leg to stand on when it comes to cleaning up Mother Nature's mess. So I think where deep tech, tying it back to deep tech, stands for me is, and going back to your comment, we have to stop thinking of the planet as linearized, externalized systems with externalized costs, right? We need to combine them all, connect them all, realize that deep tech is solving a problem, but it cannot do it in a silo. We cannot keep externalizing costs if we are to solve what is actually a social problem, right? We're fighting for humanity's survival on a planet that only has so many atoms to share around. And so to understand the cost of using atoms for different game-changing technologies and making sure that we don't just pay circular economy a lip service, I think that's what I'm excited about. For me, building the plane as it flies is more feature than a bug, but we need to take the steering wheel now.
It's so interesting, your example about the tornado, because to me that actually speaks to the need for and the potential for deep tech and hardware specifically at this moment right now. And Kate, thinking about what you said about electricity demand, we find ourselves at this very unique moment in the energy transition where for the first time in 2 decades, we are seeing this surge of electricity demand. We all see the breathless projections, but it is running headlong into a series of physical and political infrastructure constraints that are constraining our ability to scale up on the supply side. And that to me is an area where technology poses, and hardware technology in particular, poses a huge opportunity. And so the electric grid, I think, is kind of the quintessential example here. We've all heard the stats that in the US, we need to triple our transmission network in order to decarbonize the economy. But the fundamental reality is that actually the timeline to build new transmission has monotonically increased over the last decade to the point where now it's a decade plus. That's really challenging. But again, technology provides a solution. So one of our portfolio companies, Veer, is using high temperature superconducting tape to manufacture transmission wires that can transmit 5 to 10 times as much capacity using existing rights of way. So basically in the same physical footprint, if you will. And what that means is this is a scientific breakthrough that actually is compatible with those infrastructure constraints and enables us to ramp up capacity while working around some very real barriers that are preventing other green electrons from more de-risked technologies like wind and solar to come onto the grid. And this is true not just in the space of grid-enhancing technologies, but it's true on the organic materials discovery side, where new materials are enabling us to sidestep the geopolitically risky and fragile supply chains around critical minerals. It's true in energy resources that are more power dense than ever and allow us to work around what are soon to be, I think, real political battles around how we prioritize land use. Okay. And so it's, for me, the way that deep tech enables us to work around some of these political and physical battles is truly transformative, not just for the advanced technologies, but for bringing on the broader clean energy economy.
And I would just piggyback on your comment, because a lot of really cool technologies, they don't think about the fact that they're integrating into a system where they have to already start to think about the processes that have to be green, right? So a lot of, I used to have grad students in the lab with me, and they'd run fume hoods 24/7, the energy footprint of a house. And they wouldn't care. It's like, oh, it's fine. Once my technology solves all these problems, we'll be good, right? But I'm talking to like battery recycling companies now, coffee mills around the world. His partner has an algae startup that I would love to turn into something that integrates and includes smartly, so when it scales seamlessly.
I want to go back to something Lisa said about the high temperature superconducting tape, right? That's something that has really been driven by fusion, right? Fusion energy companies have driven that supply chain. And then there's these bonus effects on the transmission line front too. Like Avalanche is building compact fusion devices that we don't necessarily want to plug into the grid. We see them more as being used for distributed energy, places where the grid doesn't make sense. And so when we've got that device, it means that we don't necessarily need to install that new transmission line. We can just plop these next to where you need the energy and off you go. And that's something that I think doing the investment into deep tech enables new thinking about those scenarios.
It's really interesting as you're both discussing, because you're talking about Veer that can increase the capacity of power within the existing grid, and then talking about Avalanche creating this new technology to add on capacity in distributed scales. And that really goes back to what Dylan was mentioning of this story. We need solutions that can be applied today to solve the problems of tomorrow. And so that Veer is bridging that gap, and then Avalanche is kind of building onto it. And then when you think about membranes, which was what Osmoses does, on our side, we think about how can we carry out separations and optimize the efficiency of separations for existing processes today. And so you look at a refinery or a petrochemical facility that has hydrogen off gas that's wasted and burned as fuel. What you can do with membranes is install a membrane system that can carry out separations of that off gas, feed it back into the initial process, and then offset the emissions associated with steam methane reforming. So then you have offset emissions of CO2, increased hydrogen capacity, and then reduced demand of hydrogen for those large-scale industrial facilities that are essentially taking up the majority of the demand. I think it's about 99% of hydrogen is really used in industrial applications anyway. And so there is the use today to optimize energy efficiency and improve that kind of demand-supply complexity, but then thinking about how can we leverage existing infrastructure, for instance, for hydrogen blending and deblending. So then this talks about transmission, not on the electric grid, but on the gas front of can we, for instance, introduce hydrogen into the transmission or distribution pipelines and then leverage this existing infrastructure. And I know there's debate on whether that's possible and feasible. Then membranes could be used to separate hydrogen from methane at point of use and then be used by off-takers of different kinds and different needs. And so that is leveraging existing infrastructure to move us into a new space. And then finally, you can think of new generation technology like pyrolysis, where you end up with mixtures of gases as well. And so there's hydrogen and methane that comes out of our pyrolysis process, and you need membrane separations for that. So then in our case, we have that technology that can be applied for now, for the future, and also for that kind of transition in the middle so that we can move quickly, use existing infrastructure as we build into the solutions of the future.
I just wanted to pick up on something that Kate mentioned there, because I think this is all great, but the sense I have is that these are all first world problems we talk about. And Kate mentioned earlier, the third world, the global south. Now, I grew up there, so I have been quite an affinity with it. And I feel that the solutions that we're all talking about, that complexity of solution and all those different solutions mean that the acceleration in the global south will be easier, because building out transmission lines is not necessarily the right solution there. But using small modular, whether it's in the industrial processes or in energy generation, is a good solution for them that will be built out in the first world.
Yeah.
And just to talk about that comment, because I was going to actually push back on yours as well a little bit, right? I don't think it's an either or. I don't think it's deep tech or that. I think we need to figure out how to make this an equitable energy transition. Otherwise, there will not be a sustainable one. I think we recognize that. And I think that empowering any resource wherever you're located geographically is what, I have a good friend of mine who works at Cobalt. You're looking at using data science to find resources in existing mines that will help the countries that already have the mines there gain back some of the stuff we stripped from them. It's the first world, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's not either or. We have to do everything. I think what maybe dictates that.
And we cannot read the tea leaves, right? So that's why it's
You can't predict.
Yeah. So you just have to make it ready for them to.
Yeah. And it feels like what kind of makes that decision of how much of one or the other we do is where the money comes from, probably. Lisa, in theory, and I know, Lisa, you've been part of decisions, where should that money go and how do you allocate between new innovations and scaling existing technologies and stuff? And can you talk a little bit about how you make those decisions?
Yeah. And I mean, I think it gets back to what we were talking about. I will say, first of all, our mandate at the Engine is explicitly around translating breakthroughs in science and engineering from the research context into commercial impact. So inherently, we focus more on the transformative technology, but always with an eye towards how it integrates with existing systems, because from a techno-economic standpoint, that is a critical determinant, right? And I think e-fuels are actually an interesting example here where, in theory, there's a case that you could make where they actually can help you take advantage of a very inefficient electric grid, right? Where there are pockets of abundance in terms of cheap electricity being available at particular times or in particular geographies, but that we are incapable of moving from point A to point B because of the broken grid that we've been talking about. And yet, as Catherine pointed out, we have a very well-functioning fossil fuel infrastructure system. So are there ways that through breakthrough technologies, you can bridge between these two infrastructure systems? And I think that actually connects a little bit to the point on the global south as well, where from a techno-economic standpoint, scaling clean energy technologies and scaling deep tech in particular, per your definition, is almost definitionally the thing that makes it deep tech, right? That it's hard, which means that you are fighting against the raw cost differentials with a highly scaled fossil fuel system at a time when natural gas prices are incredibly low. And so there's actually a bit of an opportunity when you think about areas that have less developed fossil fuel infrastructure as well, in terms of scaling early stage technologies. And so I've been thinking about this a little bit in the fertilizer context, actually, where the dominant method of fertilizer production right now uses ammonia that is produced via the Haber-Bosch process, which is very centralized, very carbon and energy intensive, but because it's centralized, it depends on long, brittle supply chains that often stretch from China or Russia to other areas. And so places like Kenya and Ethiopia, where you are seeing an increase in demand on the agricultural side, struggle with access to infrastructure for fertilizer. Now, that's an area where it actually might be quite beneficial to pilot novel distributed green fertilizer production methods that replace the use of natural gas in the Haber-Bosch process with, say, electrolytic hydrogen. That's been hampered in the US because of high electricity prices, but there are places where actually you have very abundant, cheap electricity, such as in Ethiopia. There's a significant hydroelectric resource where you can theoretically get access to electricity for a cent a kilowatt hour and make these processes cost competitive where they might not be in the US, put them on a scaling curve, and then enable them to expand.
And it's funny because there's actually a startup for Stanford that's creating locally generated fertilizer, but from solar, right? So going back to energy costs, I think every geography will have its own different set of problems. Like you were alluding to the internet connection queue because we have incumbents. But in developing countries, they have a lack of resources, period. Right? So they have a different problem they're trying to solve. But now, and I don't want to romanticize leapfrogging the centralized grid, but at the same time, you see startups there in India and in Africa, basically you're looking at how in a neighborhood do we trade energy already, right? Without having to wait for the grid to build up. And then when there is a grid backbone, because everybody will need that backbone in the end, then we can play into that distributed market.
What else makes scaling deep tech hard? We're talking a lot about kind of integrating with existing infrastructure being a challenge. I'm curious, Catherine, you've kind of been part of the Osmoses journey from your early PhD research, and you've been through a lot of these hurdles. What are the things that have kind of come up that have been a challenge?
Yeah, I think we're starting to touch on them throughout the panel, but really you think about all of the incentives that have to come together to scale a deep technology, and it's you need to get the incentive with the customer, right? So you need to have an economic incentive for them, period, because they're working for it. It goes beyond the the stakeholder that you might be talking to. There's bureaucracy within these large organizations that you need to be able to go through stage gate processes to really meet those incentives. And so there's an economic incentive that needs to be met. Then there's a sustainability incentive that needs to be met that comes from the startup and also from just trying to solve the problem. So those are two. Once you unlock those two, then there's this project financing that you might need, or permitting that you need to go through, or even going through constraints related to working in different countries, right? So if we go for a project in Canada, that's going to require a different piping consideration or a permitting consideration that's very different from taking a project to Asia or even considering the US. And then there's the conflict associated with the political landscape and how that might affect the yes or no on a project. And so what makes it so difficult to scale deep tech beyond the technical challenges that all startups are facing, especially when going from breakthrough to scaling, is the alignment of incentives and understanding of ecosystem that's required in order to scale successfully and deploy successfully. And beyond that, there's this race to come up with various solutions that can meet that challenge, and having an understanding of what those solutions are and how we can build for a future landscape of energy that may include solutions of today and solutions of the future is critical. Because even in this panel, we have so many different ideas and startups that are building different things. But if you see a world where there's one technology and another one, it needs to all kind of play within the same playground. And so that's at a large scale, some of the challenges, and it goes from the beginning thinking about them so that you're not in a position where, maybe you signed a contract at small scale, but then did you think about what that might look like for long cycles and projects that need to be deployed to then scale the technology much beyond that?
A little off topic from scaling for a second, but building on something Catherine just said about how do you kind of appeal to your customers. We also think there's other levers with customers around operational and capabilities that we can introduce. So one of the early markets we see as a use case for our device is underwater autonomous vehicles. And so if you understand the way we currently do underwater autonomous vehicles for, let's say, subsea communication monitoring or pipeline monitoring, is you have a boat at the top that's burning diesel that has some number of people on it, and they drop these things down, and sometimes they're connected with cabling, sometimes they're just down there, and they're down for 12 to 18 hours until the batteries run out. And then you bring them back up and you charge them, or you run another diesel generator. But there's these people at the top that are always there, and sometimes they're only able to monitor these lines maybe once a year. And we envision a model where we stick an Orbitron into one of these underwater autonomous vehicles, you drop it off, it putt-putts around and collects all of its data, and it's there maybe the entire year, and then you come back and pick it up. And suddenly we've changed both the operational behavior of your group as well as the capabilities that you had, right? So I think those are other levers as we think about how deep tech can appeal to customers. And I know that's off topic from scaling.
I think it's really relevant to scale, right? Because for these things to scale, they have to be adopted.
Yep.
And in my personal kind of journey in climate tech, that's been something that really stands out to me is like, it's not enough to just solve a climate problem. You have to actually solve the needs of some customers that are going to buy this thing and it's going to make their business more money. That's what's going to drive a lot of scale. So I think it's actually a really good point.
Yeah, just to add to exactly that, there's that valley of death that startups go through, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't scale unless you have to accept that your early adopters, the green hippies of the world, right, will not be everyone. We can't all afford to be energy day traders, right, in the global south especially. And we should not exclude them. Otherwise, even if you don't care about them, and we should care as humanity, right, we need to figure out if we want to make this planet livable for everyone as a sustainable energy transition, everyone needs to be brought in at scale. And so we need to empower these technologies to be accessible to everyone and make that an equitable transition.
I think there's still, so even with mature technology, so, you mentioned solar and wind, that they're at a scale, but they're not at global scale yet. So with wind, you've got to get out into the deep sea. And so although the turbines might look the same, how are you going to connect them to the seabed? How are you going to get the energy back to land to where it's useful? These are still deep tech problems. The core technology might be fine, but the system around them has changed. It still needs innovators to come in and recognize that scaling is not get to 0 to 1 or 1 to 10, you're done. You've got to keep going, and there's new challenges along the way.
I think one point there, kind of piggybacking off of what Kate, you were saying, there's new operational ideas of how to operate new processes. And then there's the concept that these are very complex industrial scale systems that are already operating in a refinery, for instance, or a petrochemical facility has thousands of people that are coordinating the entire thing. And so being able to create something new while also finding out what the unknown unknowns from a startup perspective are within an existing facility, especially if retrofits are the case, is critical. And making sure that there's smoothing of that path so that operation doesn't become a hurdle, because even if the right incentives are there on the economic and the sustainability side, if the operators are completely against it, that's going to make it very difficult to deploy a project as well. And so there's a lot of things to be thought through as you scale and innovate in that.
Totally agree.
And I think another element of this is thinking about, in particular, for novel technologies that are pulling from multiple areas of budding academic research. There's a whole series of supply chain questions and concerns that emerge. And I think the fusion industry is the perfect model of how to get ahead of those. So I spend a lot of my time worrying about supply chain because I joined the Biden administration in 2021, which was when supply chain was basically all we thought about, because the supply chains kind of worldwide were totally fractured by COVID. And then once again by Russia, Ukraine 1 year later. And I think getting ahead of, from an industry standpoint, what the critical inputs will be to scale these technologies such that fusion is actually ready to ramp up in the 2030s is something that you can do a really effective job of signposting, both for then driving academic research around those innovations, but also signaling to the capital markets where the opportunity will exist. And so the Fusion Industry Association, I think, has done a tremendous collaborative job of doing that. I think that's a great model that other breakthrough technologies should think about adopting as well. So basically taking the assumption that if we achieve the maximum opportunity of a given technology, what are the inputs we would need? What is the current state of capacity versus where we'd need to go? And I think this is an area actually where government has a critical role to play as well. We've mapped all the gaps, many of the gaps in today's supply chain with a particular focus from the Department of Energy around critical minerals. But what is that next iteration for the series of leapfrog technologies, and how can we get ahead of them?
And I don't think you need to come top down and define it all. You need to enable it. So like I see all these constraints as a feature, not a bug. So as an example, if not for the interconnection queue, thermal storage would not have taken off that rapidly, because now they're looking for solutions behind the meter for their data centers. Where do you dump all this excess solar I can't connect to the grid anymore? Into thermal storage that I could swap in and out for industrial processes, right? And so I'm seeing, like, you could see all of how you can integrate much quicker, but think about these constraints as opportunities.
We certainly think about them as financial opportunities.
There's this interesting dynamic you're all kind of calling out, which as a deep tech startup, you're inventing the future, you're trying to predict the future, you have to understand where things are going to be when this technology is ready to deploy, and you're trying to influence the future, right? Policy that's going to support what you're doing, which I think is a good segue to the last topic of sort of this ecosystem of partners and other companies that you might partner with on your path to scaling. Just seems like this sort of massively multidisciplinary challenge of building a company like this. And I'm curious how partnerships have kind of influenced your path to growth. And I was going to start with you, Trudy, because
he teed me up because I was, as you can tell, not hoary. I was an airdrop in from last minute from Austin, where I was meeting with stakeholders and partners who we want to develop a port strategy for. So if you think about container ships, that is the microcosm of the world, right? We have supply chains, we have equitable energy transition, because a lot of LMI communities have to live in polluted areas and do the work of bringing in and out those trucks, right? How do you electrify these fleets of tugboats, because they can't even come into port? We don't have solutions for a lot of these spaces. And so at the table, we had stakeholders from anywhere from banks, not green banks, who wanted to get involved, right, to basically representative from a national organization that brings in diverse low, medium income labor to help bring up these projects, to energy poverty research institutes, and they all want to be involved. And I think that's the key to any technology that scales. Let's build the plane as it flies and treat these ports not overnight as a living lab, because they're all game to take a little bit more risk now. And I think having all the stakeholders at the table so that you're not building in a silo and realize nobody wants it or nobody can afford it. I think that's important because, again, a lot of people can't afford to be energy day traders. And I think bringing them all in at the table initially, even though that takes a little more effort initially, will get this to scale and solve the hardest problems first. Then everything bleeds out.
Lisa sort of queued this up for me. Fusion Industry Association has been kind of an amazing partner in terms of bringing the industry together and starting to get that published data out about predictions, about timelines, what the industry is going to need, and help to kind of lay out that roadmap so that when we work with supply chain companies, and there's 90 affiliate members in the Fusion Industry Association, I'm a board member, and they're sharing what do they need to hear from industry to plan ahead and to build the right plants. Another group that we work closely with in Washington State is the Clean Tech Alliance. They actually host Seattle Fusion Week. We're on our 4th one this year. It's later in October. And they do a great job of like bringing the community along. This year, for the first time, we're having an entire track dedicated to students and teachers. So students, how do you get into the fusion industry? Teachers, how do you bring fusion into your classroom? Those are some, I think, really important early partnerships around like, how do you have the public not just knowing that fusion's coming, but demanding that fusion be part of their energy mix. And you do that by planting seeds and working with these sorts of organizations.
On that point, on the planting seeds side, there was a really great event on geologic hydrogen hosted by the DOE, ARPA-E, Activate, and other stakeholders this week. And I think a lot about how can you influence policy by participating in non-dilutive grant funding opportunities and engaging with those stakeholders, program directors within DOE organizations or even other agencies that really are driving innovation at breakthrough levels where it's things we haven't really thought about before. But I'm thinking about geologic hydrogen, so considering hydrogen that can come from caverns or wells and creating that hydrogen that then we can take out or separate for use as a new production method in a way. And that was an idea that 2 years ago, it felt so new, and it's still new. But now there's this huge event where we're convening stakeholders talking about it in a way that makes it more likely to happen because you have more people considering the key topics and understanding it. So for me, I was learning from one of the ARPA-E fellows about what is the process for building that hydrogen within these wells and what are the separations that are required. So it really getting the right stakeholders in the room and having them talk about those things can accelerate the impact and carrying out those breakthrough processes. So influencing policy by participating in those events and even responding to RFIs, requests for information from agencies in the government can have a huge impact.
I think you brought up thermal energy storage, and that is, I think, a perfect example of how early education of policy stakeholders can put in place a series of incentives that, to your point, enable scaling of a technology. So on thermal energy storage, a series of startups in that space, as the IRA was being implemented, spent a lot of time educating policymakers on what thermal energy storage was, such that when the 45X advanced manufacturing production tax credit guidance was being developed, thermal energy storage could in fact be considered as a category that was explicitly called out as eligible for that incentive, which has dramatically changed the economics of thermal energy storage. And I think the fusion industry folks did a great job of this on the IRA side as well, where even though fusion has yet to be commercialized, fusion is specifically called out as an eligible technology in the technology neutral investment tax credit and production tax credit. So pre-planting those seeds such that then the incentives and subsidies are there to help address early cost differentials is critically important in the geologic hydrogen space. I was at this event with Catherine yesterday. It was really interesting to see learning across areas of technology as well, where I think geothermal has been around in one form or another for nearly a century, but I think the new geothermal industry has done a very good job of thinking about what the right permitting regime is for it. And there's a similar set of considerations around geologic hydrogen. Where is it similar to fracking? Where is it different? And educating people about that in advance can dramatically lengthen what is otherwise, I think, a very lengthy time to scale for technologies that are changing multiple steps of the production equation.
And we did another thing the FIA did the same thing for regulatory from a fusion fission standpoint, right? It was oftentimes fusion gets lumped in with fission, even though they're drastically different processes with drastically different outcomes. Yes, they both make energy, but they do it in very different ways. And a huge part of what the FIA did was get the entire fusion industry together to really reach consensus on what is the right way to do this so that it is appropriate to the technology. It's looking at the risks in the right way. And you saw that codified, and the NRC had a unanimous decision on it, and then it was codified into law with the Advanced Act this summer. So that gives us regulatory certainty on how fusion will be regulated, which means it makes it much more straightforward for us to talk to customers, to local government, to investors about what they should expect from a regulatory path for fusion.
And I just want to quickly add, again, it's not an either or. I mean, these are amazing. And I think Lisa's work, connecting what do they currently need now, right? And remember, a lot of the thermal storage companies are using bricks, right? But they would be the first to admit, we're not going to answer all the long-term problems that we're about to face. So hydrogen is not cost competitive yet. But companies and ventures like Lisa's, basically shows you that clear roadmap. Again, going back to stakeholder alignment, super important. I'm surprised we all have the same answer, and in my head, at least stakeholder alignment is absolutely necessary, and transparency. And how can I guarantee that this will help us continue our work and provide benefits to?
I think it's also intentionally building those ecosystems. So I think the engine is a good example of that, not just finance, but infrastructure. So labs, workshops, and then partners like us to help create that. And it's all very intentional, recognizing that breakthrough technology doesn't just commercialize itself.
I want to go to questions in a minute. I think since we have Lisa and Colin representing two other types of partners, is there anything else, Lisa, you'd say about kind of the role the engine plays?
I think Colin did an excellent job of teeing it up, but effectively, the engine was founded nearly 8 years ago as a spin out from MIT with this goal of translating breakthroughs from research to commercial impact, with the understanding that there are several ingredients in the recipe required. One being, yes, technology, but just as important, having a physical space that enabled you to take your first steps outside of the research lab, having a network of policymakers, of commercialization advisors, of experts in operational domains around you, and having an asset class that understood that the timelines for scaling deep tech are in fact longer, the capital intensity is higher, but the return on the other side of that rainbow, if you will, is much larger, because the market sizes you are looking at when you are taking on fundamental problems like steel, like cement, like critical minerals, those are huge, juicy markets in the trillions. And when the fact of the matter is that when you are scaling a clean energy technology, you have the fact that it is hard is also a benefit, in that you have critical IP around the basic science and technology, but then there's a whole other layer of differentiation and IP around the engineering and integration that goes in the scale up. So if you can in fact get over the initial hump, you end up building a very deep moat around a very broad market, such that all of these pieces can come together to achieve a financial return that's quite significant as well.
Colin, what about sort of technology development partners?
I think Lisa's just mentioned exactly that engineering and integration. This is new technology. The people who are doing it for the first time. It is difficult, but then there are partners like us. This is our day job. We do this for multiple companies in multiple sectors, and there is a lot of translatable skills where we can bring in that core technologists with a really strong engineering mindset who can kind of help get over that hump and create that moat. That's essentially what we're about.
Okay, we have 10 minutes. Do we have 10 questions? Any questions? Yeah, go for it.
So you just briefly mentioned your partners and in deep tech, there's problem. Either investment is one end, and then the other side, your partners don't have enough bandwidth to actually integrate anything in fight. So I am in the waste energy business, and one of the things I realized is I just said no to people who want us to provide service to them, because they don't have enough bandwidth internally to even deal with us and value brought to them. I mean, they don't have an integrator internally. How do you deal with essentially super slimmed down organizations that have no bandwidth. They come running up with you yesterday and trying to limit the cost of.
And you're going to repeat that.
Yeah, I'll try to summarize the question. I think is, as a deep tech company providing new technology into your customers, how do you do that when the customer isn't really set up to take on this innovative new technology and integrate it into their processes?
Yeah, I think I can take a stab at that one. It's a great question. Not every customer will be the first mover, and not every customer wants to be first because they don't have time or they don't have bandwidth or they don't have that budget. And so the key is understanding the need that is representative of the market as a whole and identifying that customer that's willing to be the first mover, that's willing to be what we call a commercial development partner, if you will, that can go through the process of piloting, that maybe will have that additional time to integrate within the facility and find the unknown unknowns and iterate. Because as you're scaling, even if the scientists or the stakeholders within the company think about everything that could go wrong, you're going to have to go to the field and you're going to have to try it out. And you'll probably find a few things that you didn't even know because the client maybe didn't mention it or because you just weren't sure what it was. So you have to try those things out and need to play with the right stakeholder that is willing to iterate with you. So in some cases, that might just not be the partner that doesn't have the time. But there's many, the need is so large and the customers are so many that you can identify that right player or the incentive that will make them make the time if needed.
So I do agree that when you're resource constrained, you do have to carefully select what will help you scale faster. Where I do want to, and actually goes back to your earlier comment, push back a little bit, is I realized, and we were acquired by Kohler 2 years ago, right? A very visionary family, but a lot of incumbent sites that they run underneath the hood that have business as usual commitments to make, right? So how do we convince them when they don't have time to be energy day traders, right, that this is important to them? So to your earlier point, what do they currently need as a gap that you can listen to and understand first? And also, what experience do they bring to the table so that they feel like a partner in this and you're not doing it as a handout to them, right?
Great question. Yeah.
So my background is in developing manufacturing processes. And I'm curious, as those deep tech companies and they make the first widget, how hard is that X phase? Do you see it as a critical part of it?
Yeah, good question. So how hard is it? So it's one thing to go to the first kind of prototypes, the first units. How hard is it to go from one to many going through that scale-up manufacturing process?
So we really believe that we want our devices to be mass manufactured at some point, right? We want a gigafactory of compact fusion machines. We're rolling them off the assembly line. We know that is a whole nother project in and of itself once we've cracked the fusion nut. So I think it's just as important. It's definitely part of the scaling. And it's as we approach the point where we're going to turn on that phase of the company, we would be looking for building out expertise and partners to come work with us on that.
On our side, we're developing membranes. And so there are processes in place that can be reused and manufacturing processes that can be repurposed. And the challenge there is, when do you have sufficient enough information or prototype in place so that then you can make a decision to build a new facility that will scale that by 10x, 20x, 100x in order to meet the demand that you have incoming from the customer pipeline. And so and I didn't mention that as a challenge earlier, but that's a huge challenge you're building the product, but at the same time, you have to make a decision on building a manufacturing facility so that then you can meet the demand that you have through the customer pipeline that you built with the initial prototype that you piloted. And so that's where leveraging Cambridge consultants or other stakeholders like that, existing manufacturing processes, can be a huge benefit, at least for companies that have processes that can borrow from existing manufacturing knowledge. And having that expertise and connecting with stakeholders like you is a huge benefit to bridge that gap. A lot of times in startups, you have to make decisions with limited information, and that's the key to succeeding, to move quickly, but also you want to have as much information as you can so that you make the right next step.
So at the risk of dating myself, when I started in school, there were no such things as living labs, right? And now I think they're much, much more prevalent. So I think finding that, right, Hala started on a living lab at a winery where we have 20 of our controllers optimizing and orchestrating various energy resources. Some of them companies that don't even exist anymore, and then various technologies. So finding that point now, because there are many out there, it's not just this winery that I'm mentioning, right? But that, and going back to dating myself, when I was in school, academia, I thought industry is separate from us. We don't do that. Now, when I talk to anyone on a campus, they are doing living labs right there. Right? And so I think finding the people who are running and organizing those and getting involved, that's where you can more quickly break that barrier.
Yeah.
Like for Avalanche, how do you manage the tension within the funding expectations of the investors? So with respect, fusion has always been 10 years away. I've always been in Princeton, and I'm old enough to remember original versions. I guess now it's 5 years away. But here, you typical VCs with the exit within 3 to 5 years. Your technologies take 10 to 15 years to, and then there's the scaling challenge. How do you address that from
Cool boy.
Yeah.
Read the question.
Yeah, good question. So there's this tension between sort of the timeline to ROI of deep tech investments and the return on investment timeline expectation from a traditional venture model. How do you manage that tension?
Yeah. I mean, I think Fusion probably has the worst right now, but I don't think this is unique to Fusion. I think many deep tech, I know, but yeah. So, I mean, I think it's just like choosing any partner, right? Is you're looking for partners who are good fits and who sit with you, understand the time, understand the market, and are comfortable with making that decision. One of the things I think we've got going for us is because we're small, we're actually able to iterate extremely fast. So my experimentalists will do some research, decide on an experiment, run the experiment, and then learn something and go to the mechanical and electrical engineers and say, hey, we need to like rev the design. And my mechanical and electrical engineers will make the changes, they'll machine it on site, and we can be up and running a new experiment within hours, days, even like next week. But it's like a very short time frame for us. And I think that's one of the things our investors see as a value add that Avalanche. Right. Our progress like is very fast because of the size of our device, right? And that was a deliberate decision by the founders to go after small. But I think it's really partnerships at the end of the day and that constant communication.
And I will say, I mean, we are uber aware of this challenge on the investment side. And I think that's particularly why to make an investment in this space, you need to believe that you are solving one of the biggest problems out there for which there is tremendous demand in a huge market, because that's the only way that you can make the IRRs work out, right? If what's on the other side is really large, even if it takes you longer to get there. But I think it actually relates a little bit to your manufacturing question as well, in that what I see as a unique advantage in the hard tech space is the learning associated with the manufacturability of these technologies. So you get to benefit from Wright's law in the way that other areas do not, in that with every doubling of capacity, your cost should decline by 20%. And solar's actually beat that, right? I think over the past decade, we've seen a 30 to 40% cost decline associated with each doubling, which in turn has meant that you have seen, I think it's Jevons paradox that speaks to this, but you've seen a concurrent increase in demand as costs have gone down, such that on the solar installation side, we've seen installations way blow projections out of the water over the past decade. So I think we beat IEA's 5-year forecasts of solar deployment by something like 200%. And it's because of that unique interaction. And so both the speed of the cost down and the market that you unlock with that cost down is something that we think very deeply about. But it means that you need to limit yourself on solving really the biggest problems first.
Okay, we're going to bring it back for one rapid fire question for everybody. And this is a good tee up to, I think we're about to go do networking, happy hour kind of stuff. So the question is, in kind of one sentence-ish, what do you need help with right now? Well, let's just go down the line. Colin.
So I'll go right back to where you started. And I think what everyone here needs help with, are probably talking to the audience, preaching to the choir here, is making sure deep tech is a solution. It's difficult, it's hard, yes, but it's a solution.
I think we just need to move away from the vertically integrated solutions and think of all solutions as ecosystems that play together and for sustainable and equitable energy transition.
Creativity in terms of offtake agreements on the commercial partner side.
We're looking for partners, folks who want to explore new opportunities or are interested in talking about working with Fusion. So come find me at happy hour.
Very similar, looking for partners. So anyone that has a gas separation need for hydrogen, CO2 separation from methane, really looking to explore those opportunities and look at your case and do some techno-economic analysis.
All right. That's it. Thank you. Hardware to Save a Planet is brought to you by Synapse. To find out more about us and how we develop hardware solutions for the world's most ambitious companies, head to synapse.com. And then make sure to search for Hardware to Save a Planet in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you like to listen. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Synapse, thanks for listening.